Welcome to my three-part series about upgrading the Paradigm Mini Monitor V5s. In part 1, I will be going over the construction of the speaker and my thoughts on the drivers, the crossover, and the enclosure. In part 2, I will be upgrading and rebuilding the crossover with stock components, with stock values of higher quality components. And in part 3, I will be going over some minor modifications to the enclosure. I hope you enjoy this three-part series, and let's get on with part 2. So the crossover. There are many sources for parts for these. I chose to go with Parts Express only because they're convenient. I'm not going to say that they have the best prices nor the best products, but you can get some reasonable stuff at reasonable prices all in one spot. But I recommend searching around for other places to get your parts. If you are trying to do this yourself with these same speakers, these are the parts that you're going to need. So you can pause right now and take a look at those. So quickly going over this, you are going to need 4 air core inductors, 2 at 1.5 millihenry, 2 at 0.37. You're going to need some film capacitors. I like to go with the Janssen brand. These are I'll show you on the bigger ones. The model is cross cap. These are the ones that I've found that sound best. I have used the less expensive ones that are branded Dayton Audio, and I'm not quite as happy with the way that those sound as compared to these. But I mean, you're cutting it close with. I should say it's a bit of a nitpick to say these are better than the other ones, but if it's only a couple bucks more, I'd rather go with the ones that I think sound better. So you're gonna need some 22, 5.6, and 1.5 microfarad. I don't know if I used the wrong units on those earlier. And then you're going to need some resistors. I recommend going with Mills resistors if you can get them. I have not used these resistors before, so I'll be interested to see how these sound in comparison. But the Mills, which I'm more familiar with, are on the tweeter circuit, which is more important for the resistors. You're going to hear these more than you're going to hear these. But every little bit makes a difference in these speakers. And last thing you're going to need is some new wire. This is silicone insulated wire, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember. But it's the higher quality stuff that's really nice and soft and has really fine wires in it. So these are also 16 American wire gauge. So it's not the heaviest you can go with, but it's better than what most speakers come with. The original speakers here, let's see what they came with, because I didn't look at that in part 1. All right, on this blue one right there, this is 18 American wire gauge. So this is 1 gauge larger than stock, which is a good thing, as well as it's made of a better quality insulator. Another thing to note is that you will need a soldering iron, because rather than using these spade connectors, everything will be hard soldered. So that means that these wires will be getting soldered directly to the tweeter and the woofer, as well as being soldered directly to these. So something that I'm going to have to do is unglue this from the connector cup here and unscrew these, as well as try and get this circuit board pried out of these, I don't know, the holder there. So these are the parts you're going to need. Overall, this was, I'd say, about $100 for everything, including the wire. And I'll go over measurements for wire in a few minutes. So I think I've covered all this. The next step will be to lay out the components for making the crossover make sense. All right, here is the layout that I will be going with. And this is just roughly laid out here on paper. The mounting board material that I'm going to be using is ABS plastic. It's 1/4 inch thick, 4 inches wide, and I've been able to fit this on a 4x5, so it'll be 5 inches long, that size of a board. And the amount of space I have within the enclosure is roughly the size of this piece of paper here. So I've got more than enough room to fit in a brand new board. Quickly, the layout here will be the common positive is over here. The common negative is over here. So the positive into the speaker will be coming into here. The negative out of the speaker will be here, as well as the negatives out of the drivers will both be coming here. The positive to the tweeter is over here, and the positive to the woofer is over here. And the components for the woofer are this inductor, so positive through the inductor, positive to the speaker, back to ground, and then the parallel will be into the resistor, into this capacitor, then to ground. On the tweeter side, it will be positive from the terminal into the 5.6 cap through the 7 ohm resistor, then positive to the tweeter, back to negative common, and then the parallel will be the 1.5 cap, and then the 0.37 inductor, again going straight to the common. A couple considerations that need to be made here is do not bend the wires on the capacitors or the resistors sharply right up next to the body. You can damage the inside of the resistor or the capacitor. I think the capacitors are going to be a little more sensitive than the resistors, but you can damage the component if you bend sharply there. So always have a nice smooth radius coming out of each component. Another one is to make sure that your two inductors are at double right angles to each other. You do not want them to be like this because the magnetic field will go, or I don't think flux has really anything to do with this, but the magnetic field will be able to couple between the two. So turn it 90 degrees this way and 90 degrees this way. And then that's all it has to be. And really that's pretty much it. The way that I'm going to choose to fasten these down is with zip ties. So in a few minutes here, I'll bring in the ABS. I'll have it roughly pre-cut to my size. And then I will, on a template, put some dots where I want to drill holes, and then I will use a drill press. You can also use a hand drill and drill holes where you want all of the zip ties to go to hold this stuff down to the board. You can also use hot glue if you want. You can use double-sided tape. You could use epoxy, Gorilla Glue, wood glue, whatever your brain conjures up to get this stuff down to the board. And really, you don't even need a board. You could put this directly inside the speaker. But for serviceability, I'm going to be using zip ties and an ABS board. So with that, I'm going to get some ABS and start laying that out. So here is the ABS that I'll be using. Again, it's 1/4 inch thick, 4 inches wide, and then this was a 12-inch length that I've cut down to 6 inches. And not to brag here, but I cut this in half with a hacksaw by eye, and that is really, really close. Now, today is actually tomorrow, and I reviewed the footage from yesterday in the last clip, and I got a little bit ahead of myself. Before I lay out and drill the holes on each of these boards, I actually want to solder this all together first so I know what its final size will actually be. And then I can lay it on top of the board and then mark out where I want everything. So this is sort of a chicken before the egg situation where you need to have it laid out and on the board before you can solder it, so you know you're not going to make it too big for the board. But at the same time, you can't just lay it on the board if it isn't already soldered, because you might not be able to solder it correctly for its board layout. But if you kind of do, 50-50, kind of like this, just lay it out, get everything neatly twisted together, put it on the board, make sure it fits, then solder it, then actually fasten it to the board. I've found that that's the best way to get these to work properly. All right, the connections are done and ready for soldering. These look pretty ugly, and they don't need to be pretty. No one's ever going to see them once they're inside the speaker, and they just need to be tight enough that the bond is between the two wires, and it's not going to be a bond through the solder. The solder is just to hold everything in place. It is not a glue that is, or it's not something that's supposed to span gaps between the components. So as long as everything's tight here, we should be good. So I'm going to clip each of these ends to get rid of the excess and then solder everything up. And it's that quick. Now the only things I'm not going to be able to solder right now are the wires that go to each of the drivers. And I'm holding off on that simply because I don't have the other one done. I do not have the crossovers on the mounting plates yet. And I would like to at least measure up with this on its board inside the speaker enclosure before I measure up my wiring. So off camera, I'm going to quickly build up the other crossover, and I will meet you back here once both of them are complete. All right, now both crossovers are complete. The next step is to figure out where I want to drill the holes for the zip ties. And these are the zip ties that I'm using. They're about a quarter inch wide, 6 millimeters. These are way too strong for the application here, but I prefer this size and this length because thinner ones tend to pinch on the capacitors a little bit more, and these ones will distribute the load a little bit better. So I have a piece of paper cut out to the same size as the crossover board. And then you just use a Sharpie and kind of figure out where you want to place everything. The nice thing is that everything's pretty springy, so you don't have to be super precise here. All right, then just for a mental note, I always draw a line of a different color between my pairs. That way I know roughly where everything is going to go. The other thing that I do when I'm drilling these out, and again, this is mainly because I use a drill press and not a hand drill, but I will put these on top of each other and drill through both boards at the same time. That way I only have to drill half the number of holes as if you were to do them individually. So you don't need to see me drill some holes. You should know how to do that. And again, I'll be back when I'm done. So this is a little bit of a jump ahead in time. As I mentioned, drilled all the holes for the zip ties to get these components strapped down, but I did not film putting the zip ties in. I figured that was a little unnecessary, as well as it would have been very difficult to film because it's very fiddly trying to get all the zip ties in while the rest of the crossover is flopping around. That said, everything is together and secure. I can shake this all I want, and it's very solid. The next thing to think about is mounting options to the inside of the speaker. Typically, I've just drilled 4 holes, one at each of the corners of the crossover, and then used stainless steel screws to screw the board down to the speaker. You know, it's usually to the bottom is where I've gone, but the MDF that these speakers are made out of is the coarser stuff, which doesn't lend itself to screws quite as well from my experience. And also because I've already added that bracing in there, it's going to be very difficult to pre-drill any holes or to even try and get a screwdriver in there to get the screws down in. So out of sheer luck, the length of each of these boards, which is 6 inches, is only a few thousandths, I'd say maybe 1 millimeter at the very most, shorter than the inside. So I'll throw up a picture right now of how perfectly these things fit in the enclosure sideways. And I think that's a really good way to do it. And what I think I'm going to do this time, while it limits serviceability, I will be using hot glue to put along these 2 edges. And with the sides of the enclosure being that close, I think that will prevent it from moving around. Because really all the hot glue has to do is prevent it from moving forward and backward and then up and down. And a nice fillet of hot glue on the edges, I think, would do that pretty much perfectly. So I think the next step in the process will be to deconstruct the original crossover from the terminal cup. I haven't given a whole lot of thought into how I want to do this, but since I already have the new crossover built, I won't be too upset if I end up damaging this in some way. And I think the only really tricky part is going to be getting this part undone. Hopefully it'll just crack, but I don't know if that's epoxy or hot glue. I might have to actually go out and get some sockets or a better pliers to get these off. All right, with just a little bit of extra persuasion and a slightly bigger forceps, they are loose. That actually wasn't too hard. I think these might actually be brass or copper because they feel a lot heavier than steel. Well, a lot denser. Now my question is, do I want to desolder these? Because I don't really have any good way of getting the wires around here. I'll have to think about that. I've decided that I want to try and desolder. So let's see how this goes. I've got my soldering iron set at maximum. I didn't think that was actually going to work there for a minute, just because this is not the most powerful soldering iron. It doesn't have the highest thermal mass to be working with, but I guess it'll work with enough patience. That one was quite a bit easier. I'm pretty happy with that. So those are successfully desoldered, and we'll make an excellent connection point from the terminal to the new crossover. Alright, I couldn't help myself. I have hooked up here some alligator clips to the terminals of the woofer and the tweeter, and I have some inputs here. So I'm just going to play a quick song from the YouTube audio library just to show that this does in fact work correctly. I'm going to disconnect the tweeter now. Quite a difference. All right, now I'm going to disconnect the woofer. From that, you can probably tell that this is doing way more work than this. So the woofer does most of the work in this system, which is all right. I would imagine this would have played down just a little bit lower, or I guess wouldn't have played so high. But that's going off the stock values here. And this is going to sound a lot worse right now than it will in the speaker for two reasons. One, I'm sure you noticed the lack of bass, and that's because this has no enclosure to work off of. This driver is tuned to the enclosure and the port. And when you take it out of that environment, it's going to sound like crap. The other thing is that these alligator clips are made of really crappy copper. You know what? It's probably even just aluminum in here. And then these clips are made of steel, a ferrous metal. So this is not going to sound anywhere near as good as hooking it up directly with the higher quality wires. All right, enough fooling around. Let's get back to work. The final step in building the crossover is getting all the wires connected. So I'll give you some rough measurements on the wires here. So you need 3 pairs of wires. The shortest pair here, which I'll just say is about 7 to 8 inches long, is for the ground and the positive to the terminal cup. The next longest, which are about 12 inches long, is for the woofer. Again, woofer positive to ground. And the final set, and the longest, which are, I'll say, about 16 to 17 inches long, are from the tweeter positive to ground. So these need to be soldered onto here. But thankfully, here's one I prepared earlier. And I also have some heat shrink here You only need about pieces that are about 3/4 of an inch long. And as you can see, I just have the terminals connected here at the end just to keep the whole thing together. The last thing you'll need to do, and I'm going to wait until I'm ready to put all this back in the speaker, is crop a bit of insulation off the end. So just strip some insulation off, tin these leads and to get them ready to go onto the speaker or the drivers. And they will need to be put on here and here. And you have to be very careful when soldering them onto here. And I'll talk about that in the next episode when I go to install everything. So I'm just going to do a time lapse of soldering these onto the other board so you can watch me do it, but not have to sit through some boring soldering. And here are the two finished crossovers. I think this is where I'm going to leave it for part 2. I think this one's gone on long enough. In the next video, I will be mounting these into the enclosures, soldering these wire ends to the drivers, as well as doing a couple small modifications to the enclosure to get those to be as good as I can get within reason, as well as I will demonstrate a little bit about how to get the dowels into the enclosures to fit correctly. So until then, see ya.